Thanks for the opportunity to be with you, and today's talk is about economic growth. That is, it is a time of economic growth. We have concluded the stage of stabilization. It does not mean that things are perfect. But we have concluded with stabilization. Specifically, when we arrived, we were on the edge of the crisis in Argentine history. We combined, on the one hand, the monetary imbalance of the Rodriguez preview. In fact, the money of Jaime was twice as much as the one we had in the Rodriguez before. For those who are younger, Rodriguez happened in 1975 after years of control of prices, tax deficit, monetary emission, all types of controls, and one day a man called Sostino Rodrigo, and he had no choice but to release, devalue, and that involved an acceleration of the inflation rate of 6 times. It went from 30% to 180% in the number of core multiplied by 5. It went from 5 to 25. We also combined in this inheritance that we received a 3 times worse imbalance in the central bank than what was in there. Alfonso's hyperinflation preview in 1989, an episode that ended with a wholesale inflation on the order of 5,000%. Specifically, we had 4 monetary bases increasing in one day. Therefore, in the face of a complicated event, the amount of money in one day could have multiplied. Which was also fuel for hyperinflation. And as if this were not enough, we had worse social indicators than those of 2001. Therefore, we were facing the worst economic crisis in history, and that is why I am always very grateful to the entire government team. For the courage to accompany me in this truly heroic play, and especially to the one who sat in the worst of the electric chairs, the best minister of economy in all history, Luis Toto Caputo. From there, we with Toto, with whom we sincerely have a symbiotic relationship. Basically shared the diagnosis that although inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, the origin of that emission was given by the fiscal deficit. Probably one of the most impressive talks was the first talk that Toto gave at the beginning of the government when he announced the characteristics of the program and showed how in reality the whole problem was fiscal. The regulations come from the fiscal problem. All the questions at the Argentine entrapment are the result of not wanting to correct the true cause of the problem, which is the fiscal deficit. Basically, patches were put on the other sides, that is to say, the fiscal deficit financed by monetary emissions then generated inflation, which allowed price controls. The depletion appeared, the supply law, reserves began to be lost, capital controls were applied. Always a central axis is the fiscal balance. In fact, there is a memorable graph that Professor Perth, president of the Congress Budget and Tax Commission used for a long time, who fights so much against the odds and who is present. Thank you, Professor, for being here. The professor showed, for example, the Argentine crisis, how Rodriguez exploded with a fiscal deficit of 14 points of the GDP, the exchange rate table with 11, the hypo, Alfonso 5 with 8, the convertibility with 7. Well, we inherited the fiscal deficit of 15 points at the GDP, 5 in the Treasury and 10 in the central bank. And in that context, we turn on the chainsaw and we started the biggest fiscal adjustment not only in the history of Argentina, but of humanity. And while they said it was impossible to make an adjustment of 1 point of the GDP, we managed to make a fiscal adjustment in rigor. At the beginning, it was 7 points of the GDP. Then the games were rearranged and it ended up being 5 points of the GDP. And after 123 years of always having a fiscal deficit, it was the first year that we had fiscal balance in a year, and we did it in a single month, but also as to a brilliant lane. Recently stated, that was not enough. That is, we could have made the fiscal adjustment and even so, we could have fallen into a hyperinflation because of the situation we had in the monetary market. And that is when what is called Stage 2 of the program began, which is when the balance of the central bank began to deteriorate, and in 6 months, not only due to the work of Torchay, but also due to the enormous work of Santiago Bosley and all his team in coordination with Pablo Coelho, they managed to make the fiscal deficit disappear in 6 months in Argentina. Therefore, we made an adjustment of 15 points of the GDP in 6 months. Wow, that is one for the Guinness Book of World Records. And from there, the inflation rate. I usually talk about the wholesale inflation because it is the one that did not have the strong contamination of the problem of relative prices is a consequence of the price hike made by the previous one, and the inflation that was at 54% end of the year around 1%. The last data of the wholesale terminó el año en torno al 1%. Was 1.5, which was still valid, the Kroll-Beck of 1, with which one could say that it is an inflation at 0.5 per month. This means that inflation passed from traveling to levels of 17,000% per year to 6% per year. Well, that is a miracle too. And that, in addition, was done without expropriations. That is, hyperinflation was avoided, which makes the stabilization program simpler because it touches everything and makes it easier. What we tried to avoid was that, since that was what they left us, planted so that with all the payments and machinery in December, we would no longer be at the end of December when the holidays arrived. But not only that, but it was also done without expropriation. For example, we did not make a Bonex plan. Everything we did, the recomposition of the balance of the central bank was done respecting the rights of property. Not only that, but also there were no price controls, the exchange rate was not fixed. And despite that, the speed at which inflation fell is much faster than what was achieved. In the case of convertibility, when you look at dollars. But of course, when we began to stabilize, the first thing was that we did not lower inflation. And we also did it by recomposing relative prices in a context with the rates only cover 20% of the cost or the aberration that we had in the central bank, that we only had more than $40 billion in debt, with which we were on the brink of a collapse. External commercial and internal financial collapse, and in addition, only 15% of the imports were paid, and in that context, first, they said that we were not going to be able to lower inflation in the first months of 30–20%. After that, we were not going to be able to lower it by 8%. After that, we were not going to be able to lower it by 4%. After that, we were not going to be able to lower it by 2%. And the reality is that when one begins to look at the data from the last year and to clean it up from the effect of the Crow Olympic, inflation was traveling at 1.5%. And there is a special chapter of what happened in the month of in March. Not only because of the issue of the seasonality that we had done, in fact, the estimation of González Rosada shows that S37 corrected by seasonality is 2.6%. But I'm not here to cry, but the most serious problem was that stupidity of the law. That was taken out by the stupid, incapable, and for the Toto de Dujaman. That forces us to have to pass a program from the International Monetary Fund through the Congress. That is to go to the place where the degenerate prosecutors are. Look, I'm going to tell you something that happened to me as a deputy. And the anecdote is interesting because it includes Prof. Esper and me. When you have the democratic construction, it's no taxation without representation. So consequently, the budget has to go through the Chamber of Deputies because they are the representatives of the people. Let's assume. Don't laugh again. Well, follow me on the argument. Look, then I talk about the Republicans, and I'm right. If I just say this, they laughed at me. So it's interesting because it's the initiating chamber of the budget. Because in the end, it's going to have to forcefully remove the money from the taxpayer to finance public spending. In other words, it's the place where the budgetary restriction should live and breathe. While Argentina has 123 years in a row of tax deficit. So how they breathe the mask of abuse, I don't know. But beyond that, it's interesting because when you are presenting a project, and the law is discussed and so on, we were assigned time. Well, now I'm in another power, but we were assigned time. And this is very interesting because, except for José Luis and me, every deputy who was assigned, I don't know, 5 minutes, spoke 10. If he gave him 10, he spoke 20. If he gave him 15, he spoke 30. That is, how could they pretend to comply with the budgetary restriction? If they couldn't even comply with the budgetary restriction, that meant complying with the amount of time to speak. Imagine if, on top of that, they don't know how to draw a zero with a glass. Of course, that's why we systematically had the tax deficit and disaster that we had. Now, once inflation began to fall, then what did they tell us? The beast with Keynesian genes. That we were going into a Great Depression. That we were going to have a Great Depression. And that is that we were going into a Great Depression. that we were going to get ourselves into a Great Depression. The truth is that adjustments of half the size generated drops in the GDP of 15%, with which something to say they had. I'm not going to get involved either. Imagine that when you are in the electric chair, pragmatism has an important dose. They don't stop looking at the other side of the library. And having said that, then they said that when the economy started to bounce back in April, then they started to say that this was going to be all, and that we were going to stabilize, but that the level of activity there was going to be fixed. When the activity began to grow, the destationing, it began to show positive rates. Then they started to say that we were going to have a naked repeater, but very soft. Then it was a naked repeater. And then they began to understand that it was indeed a short V. Or as I said, we were going to go up like a bus stop and end up having a tilt. And indeed, that is how, when one takes the destationing IMI, it ended 6 points above the level of December of the previous year, with which not only did we make the biggest adjustment in history, but it also ended up being expensive. Okay, if you don't deserve an applause from Mr. Toto Caputo. And then they began to cry with the social issues, that we don't have a heart, those things that they say. And the reality is that 11 months ago, the real wage did not stop going up. The rate of unemployment did not increase. And between the work done from the macroeconomics, the enormous work of Sandra Petovalo, cutting the job to the managers of poverty, and with participants maintaining order on the street. That's improvement of activity, improvement of employment, improvement of real wages, made that poverty measured in the monthly frequency, which is also in the works of González Rosada. The methodologies are all similar. They change only in the temporal frequency that they are measured. And that number that when we sincerely the economy, it jumps to 57%. Today it is in the 35%. It means that poverty fell 22 percentage points. That is to say that the disheartened liberals, who did not want people, took out of poverty 10 million human beings, something that had never happened in the history of Argentina, with so much force in such a short time. Finally, in the face of so many achievements. They had to criticize something. The health workers of the late Rio change type began. It seems that they did not understand that the logic of the model had changed, that we were working with. This who said, I already saw it. I saw a lot, literally. Basically because I never saw tax balance. I never saw a fixed monetary base. And then it was not good. But why not open? Well, there was a problem of stocks. And we said that as seen that we could solve the problem of stock. We were going to open the stock market. And we would have said that in any case. The stock market would end on December 31, 25. So obviously the political miserability and the incompetence of a large part of the local economists said that we were not going to open the stock market in an election year, that we were going to wait for the elections to happen. And as a result of the damn Guzman law, we, on March 1, announced that we were going to do a program with the fund, that we were going to improve the balance of a central bank, something that we had been working on since August or September of the previous year. When we began to see that the economy was not going to have monetary support, and in that context, when we announced on March 1, that we were going to hear an agreement with the fund, and that it had to go through the Congress, something that never happened in history, because before that restriction was not there until Guzman put it. Therefore, although he made an agreement with the fund without that restriction, and who complain about the masterclass that we put into politics, and that it hurts them because they all expected that we could not pass it through the fund and through the Congress, began to cry, as always in the Republican names. I mean, the truth is that I do not care about their feelings. I play within the law, I am a bully. And within the law, everything is worth it. Everything that allows the regulation was allowed in the regulation. Yes, well, let them go and look for it. They have it inside. And then all the Agoras began to say that the type of change was delayed, and that this had to fly through the clouds, and all that mountain of stupidities. During March and mid-April, we had an agreement of confidentiality with the fund, and we could not speak. And while we remained silent, while the idiots of the journalists said that we did not speak because we were scared, we did not speak because we could not release information, and that, let's say, all the enemies of the Argentinians, because it is no longer a problem that they are enemies of the government, but that they are the enemies of the Argentinians, those who have earned during the last 100 years with this impoverishing model, be it the prebend entrepreneurs, be it the corrupt politicians, be it the left-wing journalists, be it the unionists, or be it the professionals, the officials of these creepo sons of bitches who fucked up the country. And in that context, nothing. They baptized the worst of the results when we wanted to open, that this was a symptom that we were sincere about the problem, the changeable delay, and we opened. And nothing, the laboratories that sell armistice are happy, with so much pain in their tits. Sir, it is incredible. There is some he still talk about changeable delay in a context where the type of change is free. Not only did they know of the apocalyptic scenario, that it was going to break the 1400s, that it was going to go no way. The truth is that it is getting closer and closer to the bottom line. And as time goes by, and we keep having a super tax rate and taking weight out of the middle, and that when we make the placement of the Voprio, and we take out more weight, and when they start to enter the dollars from the outside, oh, how it is going to hurt. But all this is like I did catharsis. And now the reality is that this is, from now on, the only note to the fact that I am going to add is, well, but you could tell me, inflation is still high. Yes, it is still high, but I want to tell you that inflation, in the middle of next year, is going to end. And basically, it is because monetary policy acts with a lag that oscillates between 18 and 24 months. We have set the amount of money in the middle of last year. That means that inflation has a death date. And this is in the middle of next year. So now is the time to start thinking about growth. So, before we start talking about economic growth, there are two reflections that are very important for the talk. One that has to deal with the crisis, which is a phrase by Murray Rothbard, the inventor of Anarcho-capitalism, because this is central. This is central. He says, the crisis is not economic, but ethical. Although its manifestation is material, entry is spiritual, we are immersed in a philosophy, a terrible philosophy, that puts the individual as service to the state, exposed to the shadow of coercion. This is not a minor issue. You know that we are in the election year. Yesterday, let's say, the great festival of Dema in two places. That giant that I have as head of cabinet, a great coordinating minister, and who is responsible for the acceleration that the reform took in the second part of last year, and what makes his government travel at a speed of zero. We celebrated recently 500 days of government. With how many structural reforms? 2,000. We are the most reformist government in history. We made the structural reform 8 times bigger than what Menem did only if we implemented the DNE 7023 and the Basic Law. But in the year, we also removed 900 more regulations. We have already reached 2,000 structural reforms. And we have also dropped the inflation rate faster than in Menem's government. Therefore, whether you like it or not, to our detractors, this is the best government in Argentine history. And why do I mention Rothbard? And the question of why the crisis is of an ethical nature. The best example is the CEPO. Me. Years ago, I am a liberal libertarian. I say hate that hasn't changed in a single moment. And in that sense, the CEPO is a monstrous tool. Because basically what it does is not allow you to choose what you want to save, which not only has negative effects on the present, but also has negative effects on the future. That is, it produces enormous intertemporal damage, where basically you, with a CEPO, think of someone who in December 2001 had $1,000 and 1,000 pesos. If he had stayed with 1,000 pesos, today he would have $1 if we were on the floor of the band. We believe that at some point we will get there. If not, he is a little less. But clearly he would have gone very badly. So in that context, that generates a great problem. It also generates a great problem of macroeconomic discoordination, because when he set a price, generating in excess of demand, the counter is an excess of supply in the rest of the system. In other words, the excess of demand for debt implies an excess of supply of bonds. That is, the price of low and high interest rates. Therefore, an excess of supply in the goods market. Therefore, the economy does not grow, it stagnates. So that generates an excess of supply in the labor market. Salaries are destroyed. You have more poor, more indigent. And consequently, the state believes that it has to intervene and spend more, which is a vicious circle. But it also has another immorality. You go on to have more money than you want to have, the famous money overhand. And that means that it is an increase in taxes, where you are increasing the impenetrable basis of the inflation, a tax, a total immorality, a robbery, a scam. And the reality is that we as liberals could not afford that. But we could not be so responsible to let the issue of stocks boast. And in that context, we had made the account. And the reality is that with $12 billion, we could get out. So I said that if I got $15 billion, I was going to open. And then they began to say that we were not going to open because it was the election year, we were not going to risk it, that we were not going to accept paying the cost of freedom, changeable. And the package ended up being a package of $42 billion. If you want to add the anticipated renovation of China's stock market, we still have more. But we had 20,000 cash. And contrary to what the second 80s and the politicians said, we opened the stock market because freedom is not negotiated. We got the stock, we cleaned the central bank, and we are open because politics in this government was guided by ethics. It was guided by moral values, and that will definitely generate a better Argentina. But now is the time of growing, and I would like to tell some stylized facts of growth, so that more or less they can understand or assimilate the way in which we think about this kind of questions. When one studies books of growth, the vast majority of them start with something that those of us who are used to literature is called the hockey stick. It is a series of the GDP per capita from the year 0 of the Christian era to the year 2000, where basically you see that until the year 1800, this is a straight line and suddenly it turns around and begins to accelerate. In fact, if you want to split it, the GDP, let's say in all that period, it multiplied per capita by 13.8 times. However, in the period that goes from year 1 to 1800, it only went up 50%. That is, it multiplied by 1.5, and that was all concentrated after the discovery of America. While when you look at what happened between the year 1800 and the year 2000, it multiplied by 9.2 times. That is, we are living a moment that is the best moment in the history of humanity. I don't know where the leftists see that this is the end of capitalism. Truly, these kids use one. That is very good. You were right yesterday, Manuel, when you told him to insult a leftist and to say that it was a compliment. And when I said that he didn't even want to listen to the other leftists, the truth is. And also thank you for so much, Toma, Anki, Manuel. Don't laugh, because not only the leftists are ridiculous, they are office. He shared programs with the Nazi. From Bayern. He self-recognizes himself as a Nazi and wants to persecute people on social networks. The worst of all is that there are other spaces that propose the same, and they would not assimilate them like that. Are people who want to go for the universal minimum income, which is something very, very socialist. Are people who want to put controls on the interest rate and subsidize it, while they say that we should not touch the size of the state of a state that has quadrupled. Let's talk about other things better. What is interesting, what happened with the growth rate in that period, in the period between the year 0 and 1800, the global economy increased the GDP per capita at a rate of 0.2%. That is to double the GDP per capita. It took 3,500 years. Between the year 1800 and 1900, the GDP per capita jumped to 0.65%. That is, we started to need 107 years to double the GDP per capita. If we take the first half of the 20th century, the growth rate jumped to 1.1, and it was needed to double the GDP per capita. 66 years. And if you take the second half of the 20th century, it was needed to double the GDP per capita. So it took 33 years. If you take the last numbers, we are in the 20th century. What we see is that the growth rate also increases. That is, the hockey stick becomes more and more pointed. The consequence, the opposite of this, is that while in the year 1800 there were close to 1 billion, the number that reached exactly in the year 1810, the day of the May Revolution, there are a few anarchists inside, so we like the May Party so much. 95% of the population lived in extreme poverty conditions, that is, with less than $1 a day. If you looked at the data in 2020, before the disaster of the pandemic, that number had fallen to 5%. Moreover, that number is running all the time, the line for which we are going to modify the number because it has already become almost irrelevant. That is free enterprise capitalism, despite all the attacks that all states in the world do, has managed to get 90% of the population out of extreme poverty in the face of similar evidence for those who are familiarized with the micro conditions. What you are going to see is that that behavior of production, and if you take it in times of population that is increasing, that means that there are what are called growing results, that is, per unit of work that rises, production rises more than proportionally. And there's a problem that economic theory does not get along with the issue of growing results. And that is something that is very important to understand the logic of how we think the problems of economic growth. I am not going to be bothering you with the whole history of the theory of economic growth. I am going to work with very basic models that you can access, and you know them. But if one thinks in the modern theory of economic growth, in the neoclassical approach, the first article in our family is the one, a swan, the one of Salor, and in parallel, the one of Trevor Swan. That is known as the Saleh-Swan model. And in 1957, Robert Saleh went and witnessed it. Basically, the problem is that this model explained only 15%. That is, a model where only the evolution of the GDP per capita was explained with the accumulation of capital stock per capita, only explained 15%. In other words, empirically, it was quite bad. Obviously, different ways of solving this problem were tried, but one of the most interesting criticisms that appeared was the criticism by the director of the Department of Economics of Chicago at that time, George Stigler. He said, the problem is that he did not incorporate human capital. In that sense, there are two lines of human capital within the University of Chicago. One is the line of microeconomics, which was developed by Gary Becker, and the other, very important, for all of us in times of economic growth, which was developed by Javier Milei, and he was the tutor of Fortazata, one of the greatest economists in the history of Argentina, Miguel Sidrowski. However, when the profession decided to take a path, decided not to go that way, and decided to go with the idea of technological progress in an exogenous way, then all the growth within the model was explained by an outlier. In other words, that is not a model. And this darkening relationship found its light back in 1983 when Paul Romer, in his doctoral thesis, developed the first model of endogenous growth based on human capital, whose tutor of the thesis was Robert Lucas, who was basically behind the works of Isagüe. And so it is that the theory of endogenous growth appears unaware. The hypothesis with human capital takes a greater relevance, and so a very strong debate began during all the late 80s and during all the 90s until the year 2000. And in all that debate, Gregory Mankiw, David Romer, not Paul Romer, David Romer, and David Whale proceed to empirically test that model. That model makes that when they incorporate human capital, the model, instead of explaining 15%, jumps to explain 85%, that is 17 percentage points of the explanation of economic growth is human capital. Therefore, one of the very relevant things within our politics is human capital to such an extent that I'm not saying it now, because now the time has come to grow. It is so that today we are admired in the world and go around the world explaining the Argentine case, San Petovolo, by the Ministry of Human Capital. That is, we already saw it the day we arrived. In fact, in human capital, we made a very interesting partition, which is the ministry was partitioned into 4 units, if you want. One is the one that is sheltered and family, basically, to cut them when they arrive, because if the child does not form his intellectual capacity as a child, then it becomes very difficult to work. So there, we increased the UFH, we increased the seed card. In fact, in the first section, we could double. It was at spending 1 more pesa. And that was when they came to us and made the first march. And that is where Dr. Poech applied the anti-picket protocol that was not approved in its previous management, and from that we won the streak from the criminals. And now Argentina is a country without pickets. The other area is health, because you can feed them, but if people are sick, they cannot study. So we have to ensure the human capital of the first generation. Obviously, the other part has to deal with education and re-education, education for those who enter the education system, and re-education is for those who leave the system and have the will to return, and the areas linked to work. And that is where the whole issue of labor flexibility comes in. There is a part in the decree 7023, We continue to advance in making reforms in the labor market to give more flexibility and make that 40% that is in the informal plan pass to the formal plan, and once the labor market has the format that corresponds, just there you can start to think the solution of the provisional problem. The rest is demagoguery. On the other hand, we also launched a new literacy plan. But then, the issue of human capital, we are attacking it on the first day. Another issue that for us is extremely important is the issue of economic freedom. And what do you see? That those countries that are more free grow at a speed that is twice as fast as the countries that are repressed. Not only that, those countries that are more free have a GDP per capita 12 times high than those of the repressed countries. And they have 25 times less of the prey in the standard format and 50 times less in the extreme format. Therefore, all the reforms they make so that the economy is free, that will make that as we advance in economic freedom, we will have a GDP per capita higher. And basically, I have pointed out the issue of reforms. The day in 2023, there are 300 reforms, the basic law 500. They already had 800 was there. They were already 8 times bigger than the ones minimum had made. But we also, in the second part of the year, 900 more. That is, we finished the year with 1,700 reforms. It is important because recently we came to see the people of Heritage Foundation that calculates the index of economic freedom to congratulate us because never had a country made such a big leap in times of economic freedom. And what was the most interesting of all this? That only contemplated the first half of the year 2024. That is, the reforms that the basic law implies and not the year, and needing the 900 deregulations that Dr. Stelznicke made. Therefore, we are not going to give up. We are not going to stop until Argentina is the freest country in the world. I'm going to tell you a very interesting anecdote, and it shows the reformer spirit of this government and how nice it is to work with the team I have. Because apart from that, they work together. It is truly a pleasure. But there is something very interesting. In the first 15th of January, I told them to take vacation, and that they would return for the second 15th of January, and we would work there again. As you know, I like to work from our livers because it avoids me having to travel. And under the dormitory, 6 in the morning, 7, and coffee in hand, I work until 10, 12 at night. I am in Mimlivko because if I had some time, I am going to see my four-legged son with Amber and Milton, Robert, and Lucas Jr. But apart from that, Federico Strozenecker writes to me, and he says, no, I have to talk, because I am very worried. Then Federico comes to Oliver's, and he says, no, I am having a problem. The reforms are coming out very slowly. The reforms are coming out very slowly. I feel bad. This has to go faster. Imagine that I read Federico's tweet every morning, and he says, all the time it is like that. I felt bad because I said, in the end I am a novel. I am happy with little. Well, it suggests to me to make some modifications in the legal structure so that the reforms move faster, give more to that brilliant, extraordinary woman who is Mary Hilda Sabo, who is the legal brain of all the reforms. And he says, no, give more resources, because it also has a political sense to make the laws. So, she is a person with a talent. Mary is our government. What I read was a Caputo, so that more or less you can visualize it. So, nothing, I start to look at everything. Now I grab and ask for an account of what we were doing. Someone is encouraged to think that the reforms had applied Federico in just half a month because we were coming wrong, according to Federica. 65. That is the equivalent of 130 monthly reforms. We are talking about 15 sexennially. What I want you to see is that this is the most reformist government in history, and we are not going to stop until we are the freest country in the world. But the whole issue is not there. There is another issue, that this is the one that comes to me. Now comes the part, if you want, harsh or harder, in terms of economic theory, and that is, I already talked about the role of human capital. I talked about the role of economic freedom, obviously. Within economic freedom, they have a chapter that has to do with openness. That is, they have 3 pillars. That being said, of a huge job that Manuel Adorni, the owner of El Abasto, because let's say the canal of the city, which they should close, is in El Abasto. I was a neighbor from there. One of the things we did, we had a very ambitious government program, and everyone said it was impossible. And one of the things that began to happen to us, when we looked at the networks, people said, this is more than diverted. So we said, well, let's test how we are. And the reality is that Manuel began to highlight the information of what we had promised and what we were doing. I mean, everyone said it was impossible what we were going to do. So if we had not fulfilled anything, we would be in the same as any politician. But if we did it linearly, we would have to have fulfilled at least 25% of the promises as a campaign. Well, we finished the year by fulfilling 97% of the promises of the campaign, and since we have already opened CEPO and there is a currency competition, we have already done everything we had promised. So it is the first time in history that in less than a year and a half, we have the government absolutely demanding with the goals that everyone said was impossible, and we have already fulfilled them all. That is, we dedicate ourselves to make possible what everyone says is impossible. And now, yes, I am going to the core of growth. This is the part that is not so traditional, and that is with which we are walking around the world and explaining to everyone the core of Argentine growth. Basically, there are some indications of this in my recent book called Capitalism, Socialism, and the Neo-Fiscal Trap. And it is the theme of the role as they're growing yields, let's say, But to understand the problem of the growing yields, we have to understand the nature of the neoclassical economy. Now, if I look at the growing yields that I have for those who know about general equilibrium, literature labels as non-convexities, structures of concentrated market in the limit to monopolies. In that context, according to the neoclassical theory, concentrated structures or monopolies are bad. As someone will explain to me why in the last 250 years, we went from extreme poverty of 95% to 5% in a world where it multiplied by almost 10 times the population. Someone can explain to me why that is bad. Nowadays, a middle citizen of a reasonable country lies better than any emperor. Someone can explain to me why that is bad. Why are economists so arrogant that when the model does not match with reality, we call it market failure? No, it is not a market failure. It is a problem of the model that is corrupt. So, now, what do we get? That some of these things are bad. And as it could not be otherwise, it comes from someone who is kind of deaf. Named Wilfredo Perita. So, when the problem of equilibrium that we originally studied, if it exists, if it is unique, and if it is stable, until then, things are not so slanted. The problem is when we wanted to apply in the optimal Pareto, the Pareto efficiency, we had to choose between the factory of pins, the growing yield, and the invisible hand. And then we opted for a mathematical vision of the invisible hand. That's implied to throw it to the growing yields, and it happens that the economy that was born supposedly with Adam Smith. I mean, there are some reflections at Genefund that are to rent balconies, but I say that is, and they are 350 years before Christ, but it does not matter. What I am going to do is that we throw to the shit the factory of pins, we throw to the shit the growing yields, and we cannot explain the economic growth. And supposedly, the book of Adam Smith, as the investigation is called, is the cause of the wealth of the nation, and what it tries to explain is the economic growth. That is because of a question of misinterpreted mathematical processes. We are left without explaining the economic growth. That is because if you have constant performance scale, you cannot explain the economic growth, and that is because of the damn optimal Pareto. So it is important that we understand what the optimal Pareto is. The optimal Pareto is a situation where it is not possible to generate any kind of improvement without harming another individual. That is, when is there an improvement Pareto? An improvement Pareto is when you can improve someone without fucking anyone's life. That is, you can do it, and that is an improvement Pareto. And when that possibility of well-being gains is exhausted, you are already at the optimal Pareto. That is, these possibilities are exhausted. But there is another more complicated part. It is as if you are inside the border of the possibility of production. And then how do we get to the border? But there is also another discussion that is along the border, that say, under any assignment, at any point on the border, that point is optimal Pareto. From there, the two theorems of the well-being economy. The first says that all competitive balance is optimal Pareto. There is a whole discussion about how we define competitive balance. Let's say, imagine as an adherent to the Austrian School of Economics. I don't like the term, but I don't care because we are discussing different things. Not so much, but well. But the second theorem is worse. The second theorem is a band. And it says that it is independent of the distribution of income. That is, he can reach the optimal Pareto independently of the distribution of income. It sounds very nice, but that is a huge shit. If you have to define an economy, when he studied general balance, he studied that. Then how do you define a debt economy? So he said, define a private property economy. What does it have? It says E equal, open key. It has U, that is, the utility function, the preferences, T to reflect the technology. It has to represent the initial donations, and pi equal to 1. That is, the benefits are all in the private sector. According to this, it is independent of the distribution, and then, because of the second theorem, I can get pi to shit. It is the same, and I am left only with the preferences, with the technologies, and with the donations. G realizes stupidity of what I am saying. Nobody realizes. Nobody stands up and says, motherfucker, you were born deficit. That is, you are going to tell me that is the same to live under capitalism than to live in real socialism. I tell you that in the year 89, the wall fell and it was a failure. In the economic, in the social, in the cultural. They killed 150 million people. It is not the same. It is wrong. It is false. Why? Because socialism is impossible. The second theorem of well-being is shit, it is wrong. Basically, why is socialism impossible? Well, for one simple thing, without property rates, there is no economic calculation. You exchange goods, and when the goods were exchanged, suppose that there is money, then we can discuss what money is. What is that to you? It marks a price. I give you my glasses in exchange for X money, X amount of money. Then, that becomes a transmission mechanism of information that coordinates. Some will be buyers, others will be sellers, and generates an adjustment, because if they do not coincide in supply and demand, the price will vary. If you do not have property rates, they do not mark the price. If they do not mark the price, the system is a derivative. That is why, in socialism, it would give the same to make a rat with a bridge of gold or crystal or cement. If there is no price, Toto pays another. The other. That is why it was part of what the communist spies did, was to send people to see what the prices were. The other is impossible because knowledge is dispersed. This is what Hayek said about information in society. Knowledge is dispersed. And the only mechanism that the human being inventor, that must be one of the most wonderful inventions that the human being had, that no one invented because he invented it by the spontaneous order, was a price system where each one, with his will to buy or sell, transmits information, and for that, it needs to be decentralized. It does not need a centralized organization to do that. In fact, no one can do that. And there also appears the proposal that Israel Kirchner and Jesus Way to the Soto made about the impossibility of socialism and the role of information that must be created and discovered in all this process. If I have a company A that has done well and has waste, well, it wants to get rid of the waste from above, it will have to pay to get rid of it from above. But it happens that there is a company B that produces another product that needs the waste of the other as a source. Then a guy can appear in the middle that says, wait, I can pay this one to get the source and sell it to the other. And in the middle, he won money. That is, he discovered a business opportunity and he's applying it. Consequently, There I have a profit of well-being, but that can only happen if there are prices. If there are no prices and death, I want to exercise that activity. They are going to steal the results. It will not happen. So the quotient that a state generates makes it impossible for that to happen. That is why I say that socialism always generates misery, because it does not have the role of the system of coordinated prices, and also it breaks any intention of doing something. In addition, there is a problem of incentive. Let's say, if the one who works well takes the same as the one who does nothing, but what are they going to do? So you have problems of static range and problems of dynamic range. That is, the first is how they do to collect all that information. Let's suppose they invent to make a computer, but did it. Even so, they will not be able to do it. Do you know why? Because a lot of the information that you need to act on this quote has to do with the know-how. The other day in a chat, I was joking with my friend Mike Pucciano, and he said, well, I call him Michael Jordan. I tell him to tell me how he does to turn the ball in the hoop. Nothing. No matter how well Michael Jordan turns the ball, I doubt he can do it. But if he did it, Mike cannot do it. In principle, he does not measure 1.98 meters. Look, if we ask Jack Colonial, who measures 2.30 meters less, so that makes it impossible to do it. But one more thing, the market is a process of discovery. The information that they need to act, it is an information that is being created at the same time that they are acting. However, that information can never arrive in time and form to the control organ that needs that information to solve the problem of the assignment. Therefore, it will never arrive in time and form, and when the information arrives and makes decisions, they are always wrong. Only by chance it could work. For not only that, but also, how is it that people were saved under the real socialism? By making transactions in the black market, in the parallel market. That is to say, the only way that socialism had that people did not starve was to allow people to evade the controls, or use an oxymoron. That is to say, for it to work, they had to stop making controls. That is, they are contradictions in their terms, and they do not realize it. Notice that the first year, that is, when you start the year, you have to, a year. For example, this year is the year of reconstruction, but last year, how did we apply it? The year of life, freedom and property. That is to say, we were thinking about this so that the economy would start to grow. Hence, I have repeated the definition of liberalism by Alberto Venegas Lynch's son. Liberalism is the respect and restriction of the next person's life project, based on the principle of non-aggression and in defense of the right to life, freedom and property. Notice that list is showing something about how the system should work, and that when we get to the end, I'm close, believe me, I'm not that far. You will see that it will make total sense. And in that question, when we start comparing the damn optimal of Pareto against what happens in reality, is something else. We call it market failure, and there are 4 market failures. Basically, they are non-convexities, externalities, publicities, and information failures. That on the one hand, we have all the work of the theory of contracts with the problems of adverse selection, moral risk, and signaling, or let's say, coordination, which is basically a problem of theory in games. Has anyone noticed that this is the dilemma of prisoners? Why does the dilemma of prisoners work? Yes, but the information is blocked by him, by the captors. I mean that the failure of coordination in the economy is the result of the existence of the state, blocking the communication between the agents. The state is always the problem, never the solution. That is why we have shrunk 30% of the size of the state by making the adjustment we made, and that so mainly in the public sector, and that is what made the adjustment expansive. What? I will not go into each of the discussions of the problems of the so-called market failure. I will stay with the issue of non-convexities and with the issue of technical progress. The first thing that will happen to them with the dam optimal of Pareto is that they cannot explain economic growth. They cannot explain technological progress. Let's get into this situation. We stop at the end of the 19th century, and there was a group as happy people producing candles. Then a man came named Thomas Alva Edison and invented the electric light bulb. How can you imagine that? The candle producers were always as sour as the tits. But they had something worse. I don't know if they had a damascene. That's it. The first thing they have to understand is that that is not optimal of Pareto. I mean, technological progress is not optimal of Pareto. I mean, because one won and others lost. So the question is, would you like to go back to the time of candles because of the fucking optimal Pareto? Aren't we better now with light, with air conditioning, all these computers, phones, and everything we have today? It seems to me that they are not optimal Pareto. I'm not saying they're as bad as the journalists, but optimal Pareto is bad. In that sense, there is a wonderful book called The Economy. In a lecture by Henry Hazlitt, the last re-impression of the book, let's say, has my prologue that I tell what happened to me when I met the book, and it has a chapter that is called The Hate of the Machine, that basically is a mockery of the TEFO fallacy, and that basically is a problem of equilibrium. Henry Hazlitt separates the first lesson. The lesson is, what is the difference between the good economist and the bad economist? The bad economist is the type that only looks at partial equilibrium, not only looks at the markets, and does not look at the consequences that this has on other markets and the impacts in the future. In other words, he's a fool who makes a model of partial equilibrium in a single period. He is full of those. They do not laugh. And on the other hand, the good economist is the one who looks not only at this market, but also at the relationship with everyone else, and also contemplates the impact on the future. He must be a type that does intertemporal general equilibrium. So the reality is not good for the machine will leave the unemployed people. Bullshit. That person who created this technological progress, what is he doing it for? To earn money. Now, what does he do with that money? He earns. Look, if he grabs and spends it, he will generate jobs where he is spending it. The alternative is that he will not stand it, because he is a son of a bitch, and he will save it. Look, if he saves it, that finances the investment elsewhere, which will generate growth in jobs elsewhere, in addition to more productivity. But let's suppose not. If he consumes it, he does it well. If he saves it, he does it well. Then he has to be more son of a bitch. He has to grab and put that money onto the mattress. He has to hide it. While they are taking money from the economy Therefore, it lowers the price level and favors them all. That is, when you think in terms of general equilibrium, all this bullshit falls out. But there is one who the other day said, now the minimum wage has to be 2 million pieces. Why not? Firm a green stick? If it was so easy with the economy, then try to see how the fuck this problem was fixed. So the first thing he did was, well, let's put a patch on the salo model. So the first patch was picked by Edmund Phelps, called the Gaussian rule. Then he tried to look for a consumer maximization that would allow the economy to grow. A consumer maximization. It was a patch, and as a patch does not fix the problem. Then they said, no, well, the problem is that this model is not optimal. In other words, the problem is dynamic efficiency. Let's fix the problem of dynamic efficiency. When we want to fix the problem of dynamic efficiency, two authors, one cast, and the other Catmans, separately, one in continuous, the other in discrete, begin to review and find that in the year 1928 there was a boy called Frank Plumpton Ramsey who had an excellent relationship with John Maynard Keynes. He said, but not in the extra academic. I don't know why he laughs. In Manga de Macarillos. So, in that context, what happens? He had an optimal saving model, so they rescued the model, and this is what today in literature is known as Ramsey's model. It is not as it is because Ramsey had the problem, let's say, of how to put the discount. Considering that he was amoral, there was a discussion there. But well, here, Catmans, he didn't care about that. They needed to cut the set of intertemporal preference bigger than the population, and they could solve the exercise. Beyond that, in terms of mathematics, what is the problem with this model? Well, yes, now it is optimal. But what is the result? When it goes from there to there, it collapses the same result, because what ends up sending is the budget restriction, and the budget restriction is the production function. So if you work with this model that has constant performance, or marginal growth performance, you will have an optimal budget. It will allow you to get a maximum. But what is the problem? You can't grow. Very nice for the optimal budget of the general equilibrium model, but we can't explain economic growth. What do we do? Well, what we did was explore a better word. That was the one that sent me to the Austrian School of Economics, which is called Monopoly and Competition by Murray Newton Rothbard. And where basically the monopolies are not bad, except that they are monopolies. According to the original definition of Lord Coke, he said that a monopoly is when the monarch was occupied by what? In that place, he only saw one type, an X key to the one he wanted to compete with. Fortunately, customs have changed in time, and today you could have a company in the cell phone market, 10 different companies, and one appears and makes a cell phone of better price with better quality. What do you think is going to happen with the remaining 9? Are they going to broke? And you would say that this guy is a bad guy, or that he's bad, or that he is a monopolist. Why don't you get angry with the 9 that went broke? Because he is a social benefactor. Because now you can have a cell phone of better quality or better price. And on top of that, the money that he saved, he can spend it on other goods. You live much better, so you don't lose work, you don't lose anything, and besides, everything lies better and you have more productivity. Therefore, monopolies are not bad. It is a problem in the neoclassical mind. Now, what is the problem? Better if I think in neoclassical terms. what is going to happen is that when you see a monopoly, it is going to regulate it. And when you regulate it, you are going to regulate it for what? Surely for capital basis, or if you want to put the price cap, it always ends up collapsing, which you have to do, mapping with the capital basis with which you end up regulating it by capital basis. What does this mean? That it is a middle cost rule. And if you have a middle cost, flat fund or recurring sites with the marginal, consequently, it gives you a result that is, according to the literature, optimal for Pareto. And if, let's say, you think in terms of market, it is disputable, and the middle cost curve has a flat fund, it gives you the same. I say it is going to give you an optimal for a Pareto as well. And if it doesn't, it will give you a better second solution. If that is the case, then when you do that and regulate it, what are you doing? You are making the competitive bounds, and therefore you are simulating it in a situation of constant performance at scale. And the day you assimilate with constant performance at scale, you have killed economic growth. One example of this, the most regulated area in the world. Europe is stagnant, it doesn't grow. Therefore, essential access. Our policy is deregulation because as we deregulate it, we release growing performance. When we release growing performance, we begin to grow. And that is the task that Federico Sturzenegger is carrying out. And that is being in mind by everyone, and the reason why Kristalina Georgieva incorporated it as an advisor of the International Monetary Fund to advance in all these things. And that is a policy that is inspiring everyone, with which, let's say, thanks to Toto and thanks to Federico, I will be able to go to conferences in peace. And now, the last theoretical pill. And it is this topic of dynamic efficiency. I strongly recommend reading either the original article or the book of Webster de Soto, but there is a phrase that I find phenomenal, because dynamic efficiency is defined as that institutional arrangement that makes the border of possibilities of production expand as strongly as possible. That is, it runs to the right, as God commands, but also remember that I am a libertarian paleo, an anarcho-capitalist, let's say, who believes in God, that is, an anarchist as God commands. But let's say, apart from that situation, oh, if I don't put my glasses on, it's complicated. But those are phrase that I find fabulous, which is something incredible. I say it's incredible because if you understand this definition, you will be able to see a home go of economy and make the economy go down the dynamically optimal path. And it says, justice and efficiency are two sides of the same coin. The fair cannot be inefficient, and the efficient must always be fair. Notice that at some point, I talked about how politics in our government is guided by ethical and moral criteria. The general framework of ethical and moral that this government carries out is the definition of liberalism that Alberto Venegas has given to Enchicha. Therefore, I can put the economy on the dynamically optimal path without knowing anything about the economy, only by daring the fair, because the fair is efficient. And the only system that fulfills these characteristics is a system of free market capitalism. There is a beautiful book called Creativity, Capitalism, and Distributive Justice by an author called Israel Kachner, with a Z, not with a CH. Please. One of the things that Israel Kirchner raises is a truly amazing thing. He says that the capitalist system is labeled as unfair, and he says, you know what? If the system is unfair, it is not worth defending it. I don't care if it is more productive, I don't care if it is more efficient. It is unfair, it cannot be defended. It is a giant of mud feet, and therefore it is unfair. If I am defending these ideas with so much impetus, it is because the book advances and using the principle of luck appropriation and Hayek's idea that the market is a process of discovery plus everything I talked about before about entrepreneurship. All this conjunction shows that the only system that is fair is free market capitalism. I stress free companies now, pro-businessmen and power friends. Therefore, we go back to Rothbard's phrase, the crisis is an ethical problem. If we bring 100 years of moral decline, it is obvious that this country was going to be a ball, and the only thing that could get us out of all this is a revolution that is not only economic, but is essentially a moral revolution, and that is why we are coming out, because we have raised the values of the West again, and that is why we are growing, and we are going to become a global power in 30 years. And now, this is all that is left, because it seems all very interesting, but come on, I need, mate. I say a skeleton is fine, but dying. Why are we going to grow a lot? Because we are going to become a global power in 30 years, and we are going to grow a lot. The latest data, 85.7% per annum. The unannounced 0.8%, says Javier traveling at a speed of 10%. The first quarter will be around 6%, the second at 8%. Jose Luis Dulce himself says Argentina will be the country that grows the most in the region in 30 years. Toto Caputo himself says, we are going to stop talking about Chinese rates and we are going to talk about Argentinian rates. In fact, in the World Economic Outlook of the fund, we are already second in the ranking. India comes first, then us. So, based on what do we say that we are going to grow? Point one, the fiscal adjustment. The fiscal adjustment of 15 points of the GDP was 15 points of the GDP. The fiscal adjustment was leaving the public sector, and now it was returned as a form of income to the Argentinians. They can consume it, or they can invest it. Whether they want it or not, they will generate a greater expansion. The more you save, the more you invest, and the more you grow. The second point, which is not as low, is the deficit zero. The deficit zero means that you do not debt to road that is not to take need that, please, because let's say if a prisoner appears with an intellectual coefficient below that of a primate, he is not taking debt. So it's like sometimes a discussion with those people is complicated. Well, I guess today you had to deal with Santanga. Well, but feel ashamed to be a Kirchnerist. He did a great job there, Manu. Now, the opposite of this is that then, if the economy does not grow or grows a little, the debt-product relationship then is decreasing. If it is the debt-product relationship is not growing, that is, it remains constant or falls, it means that Argentina is solvent intertemporally. If Argentina is solvent intertemporally, inexorably, sooner or later, the risk of the country has to explode. Argentina is one of the 5 countries in the world that have financial balance. Therefore, sooner or later, Argentina will be investment grade. I make a clarification, let's say, because I see so many failures in international monetary economy issues of people who worry about the accumulation of reserves when there is a type of flexible change. I don't know, the books that I read did not bite. Apart from that, we recapitalize the central bank. We are going to go out into the markets because the risk of the country is below 700. In addition, we have a put that the American government put on us. They can look for real ghosts. Apart from that, I warn you that the fall of the risk of the country will lower the interest rate. When the interest rate drops, be careful that the countries that lower the interest rate know what happens with the external account. As the internal balance implies a higher interest rate, it generates a current account deficit. But how does that current account deficit generate the private? It is a problem of the private, and the exchange market is resolved. Uncle, they don't let themselves be carried away by the current account deficit. The problem of the current account deficit is if it generates the tax deficit. If it is a problem of the private, it is a problem between the private. I say, please start taking up the chips of those idiots who sunk into this country. Or the others, right? People are going on a trip. I say, what do you want? Do you want us to be miserable slaves that we can't even move from the house? I say, we have to put I say, in the summer, what do? We put a fountain of water to refresh ourselves. Yes, man, we are going to be rich, and as part of that, we are going to travel around the world. Yes. What is the problem if I take it out of my pocket? I say, a lot of people blanked out, and that money that they blanked out that comes in as income of capital. Yes, they left it and they smoked it in another country on vacation. What is the problem? Uncle, please try to be able to identify a simians. Well, no, planet of the simians is smarter than these beasts. But beyond that, there is a wonderful work by Juan Pablo Nicolini. He says a deficit zero assures me a growth floor per capita of 4%. I can assure you that I am strongly committed to maintaining the fiscal balance. In fact, in the face of the deterioration of the external conditions, we only need 1.3% of surplus and primary, and I decided that we pass it to 1.6%. And to have an order of magnitude of what we are doing, because the last year was 1.7%. First, let's say if the GDP increases and the interests are the same, it is less money. But in terms of GDP, it is less. But beyond that, there is a fact that they are not contemplating. It is that we eliminated 16 taxes. One of the taxes we eliminated was the country tax, which is 1.5% of GDP, with which we are going to an equivalent of last year's 3.1%. Do you realize? What happens is that, what is where we said, that as the economy grows, we are going to lower taxes. The economy is growing. What do? We lower taxes. We are the first government in history to lower taxes. But as Professor Juan Pablo Nicolini says, that work they did only contemplates the fiscal balance. But that fiscal balance, you could have done it by increasing taxes. We did it by lowering costs, therefore we have more to grow. And it does not contemplate structural reforms either, with which I repeat it again. I am going to say in Latin, the Argentine economy is going to rise as a Peter the Buser. Not only that, but also we are going to end up eliminating inflation. Therefore, the distortion of relative prices that killed economic growth is also going to disappear. We are also planning to make a tax reform that generates competition between the different provinces. There is that people start to vote with their feet. Look, as how in the United States, for example, Elon Musk was in California, he went to taxes. He also did it in Galperin. So basically, we are going to generate tax competition. We, for example, IVA, we are going to charge our IVA, the national IVA, the provincial that is held in the provinces and that compete. They want more investments and they are going to have to charge less taxes. Enough of a lack of tax correspondence. There is going to be tax correspondence now. I mean, if I want to spend more, charge taxes and put it here and show you people and that those taxes have a counterparty in spending, because if not, you will probably end up in them. So, and we add to all this what we are doing in human capital.
Y a todo esto le sumamos lo que estamos haciendo en capital humano,
the deregulation until we become the freest country in the world, and also an increase in the economic opening. Consequently, dear ones, welcome to the new Argentina.
Estimados, bienvenidos a la nueva Argentina.
Because we are making Argentina great again. May God bless you. May the forces of the sky accompany us and long life freedom. Damn it.
De esta manera despedimos al señor presidente de la Nación y le pedimos a los presentes que mantengan